right now. So the first question, please.
I'm Helen from the Socialist Alliance. I teach Syrian refugees in high school, and in my conversations with them, I found them to have a very loyal and affectionate attitude towards Bashar al-Assad. I'm also aware of a number of political activists and academics who are passionately defensive of Bashar al-Assad, despite all his atrocities. And I would ask you to explain why these people have this attitude.
In my day job at the moment, I'm a refugee support leader for the Department of Education. And I spent 6 months working with Helen out at Fairfield. When Ilan's was washed up on the beach and it sort of sparked a wave of global sympathy for the plight of Syrian refugees. There were mass protests around the world, Get Up organised them here, and Tony Abbott 1 week said, no, we're not going to, and the next week he said, we'll take 12,000. But what he did was to say, we are going to take the Christians and Assyrians from the northeast of Syria and the northwest of Iraq, who are in ISIS-controlled territory. We don't want the Sunni Muslims who are fleeing Assad. So that's a bit of a simplification, because there were some who came out on 202 visas under family sponsorship, who were Sunni. But what I've noted, Fairfield and Liverpool are very much, I was very surprised at the fact that we had 390 students at that school. At its height, it went up from 130 to 390 in 6 months. There was about 3 or 4 scarf-wearing girls in the school. The vast majority were Assyrian Christians, Chaldeans, and so on. I'm not holding anything against the fact that they managed to get to Australia. They deserve to be here. However, it's pretty clear that the Australian government took a very discriminatory, because of its own Islamophobia, discriminatory approach to who they were going to select. I'm at Beverly Hills Girls High School now, because of its proximity to Wiley Park, Lakemba, Belmore. The Syrian refugees there are overwhelmingly Muslim, overwhelmingly. So it's just, I think, a tale of different suburbs within Sydney. And I was shocked when some of my Syrian refugees, on the day that Trump was elected, said, what do you think, sir? I said, well, I don't like Clinton, but this is a disaster. No, sir, he's great. He's going to get rid of ISIS. So I think, you know, we certainly can't treat Syrian refugees or any refugees in any kind of homogenous fashion. Let's remember too that by the time the mass exodus of Syrian refugees occurred in 2013, 15, 16, the Stop the Boats policy and the military blockade of Australia had already been imposed. So most of the Syrian refugees have come under the official program, as opposed to Europe, where they have, you know, gone, you know, voted with their feet, so to speak. So I think it is a complex situation. I certainly wouldn't assert that every Syrian refugee is anti-Assad because of the nature of where they come from. Sorry.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thank you for your interesting talk, informative talk. My name's Kieran from the Management Committee of the Politics in the Pub. Okay, it's a do you agree statement. I'll ask, okay. The Saudis and the Americans, and no doubt Assad and the Russians too, would prefer a reactionary Islamic fundamentalism to the victory of a secular, progressive, Arab Spring-inspired Syrian left and the success of the Kurdish Rojava Revolution along the lines of there is no alternative, either Western neoliberalist fundamentalism or Islamic fundamentalism, which is always useful in justifying a permanent war against terror at home and abroad. Would you agree?
I mean, I think that's why it's quite hard to get, for some people it's quite hard to get one's head around the tactical shifts that the PYD have to make, the Kurdish-led forces have to make, because they are surrounded, and the interests of the Russians and the Assadist sections of the Free Syrian Army and Turkey are all playing their hand, and the US imperialists are all playing their hand and playing out in that region. and the Kurdish-led forces have to survive. And that is that unfortunately there are US troops in Kobani, and the Kurdish comrades say they just don't have the strength to move them out. But they're not pro-imperialist, and they want to move them out. And there's a really good book. There was a volunteer who went in, an academic who went in and did 50 interviews with leaders in Rojava about the tactical alliances with the US and what people thought. And, people were very clear. They didn't want to have an alliance with the US. They wanted to have more strength on the ground. But when they demanded, when Kobani was under fire and they demanded action from the US and there was some action taken, it meant that Rojava could live for another day. But then the US have, completely sold out and betrayed them on a number of other fronts. So, yeah, I still contend that a democratic confederalist model is what Syria as a whole needs, and it would be of real benefit to have the process expand beyond where it is now, which is really 2 cantons, liberated cantons and Raqqa. But I think for that we also need to enhance our solidarity action with the Kurdish-led revolution. And I think that, if there's some practical things that come out of tonight, it would be joining the Rojava Solidarity group and asking your unions and the student organisations that we're all involved in to sign on to the Amor Afrin, Si Amor Afrin campaign, which involves funding to help refugees and rebuilding Kobani.
I just make a couple of quick comments. One is that the Americans managed to deal with Bashar al-Assad until 2011. He wasn't their favourite man by any means, but he was a man they could do business with. And if you think about the southern border, Bashar and his father managed to keep the border with Israel pretty quiet for a very long time. So he serves a particular purpose there as well. The last thing they want is some sort of government that would actually pursue the interests of Palestinians or whatever. So I think we all agreed, we all said yes, and I think there's a number of factors why that is the case.
Brian Concannon. I have 2 quick questions. The first that I'd like to know your views on. I've read a lot of credible material from Information Clearinghouse and Paul Craig Roberts, etc., saying that ISIS and Al-Qaeda mercenaries are being supported by US, Israeli, UK, French and other forces in their attempt to balkanise Syria for Israel. Also, there is a lot of credible information pointing to the White Helmets being the media arm of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, using false flag chemical weapon attacks to fool the US and coalition of the willing to install a no-fly zone and bomb the shit out of Syria. Love to know any views you have on those 2.
Gladly. On ISIS, I mean, what we can say, I think, is that they grew out of the US invasion of Iraq, the devastation. Many of them were former Abu Ghraib, people who were tortured. And so it's basically the catastrophe that the US imposed on Iraq was the breeding ground for ISIS. But I really reject these conspiracy theories to say that the US directly supports ISIS. I mean, what was the bombardment of the eastern part of Syria and the western part of Iraq, which Australia participated in alongside the US? And it has to be said the main beneficiaries on the ground of this US-led invasion were the Kurdish SDF forces on the ground. And I think that's a slight contradiction in terms of the anti-imperialism that Rachel expounded. I think we need to investigate that a little bit. So I reject that sort of conspiracy theory, but even more strongly, I reject any notion of the White Helmets being anything other than humanitarian heroes, which pull victims of Assad's barrel bombs and Russia's mass bombardment campaigns out of the rubble. And I think we should tip our hats to the bravery of those people. I also reject all the conspiracy about false flags. People say, why would Assad do the latest chemical attack on Ghouta when he was already winning? Well, actually the resistance was continuing despite the use of conventional weapons. What happened after the chemical attack? Even the most vehement fighters in Ghouta surrendered and fled to Idlib. It had a military purpose. It was a rational decision on the part of a brutal dictatorship and his allies. So all of the conspiracy crap, I have to say, is that's what it is. That's what it is. That the chemical weapons serve the purpose of that dictator. And any attempts by people like Tim Anderson or any of the others, or you yourself, Brian, these crazy people who think that they're part of the left, but subscribe to all of the kind of conspiracy theories that the far right also expound. You share with the fascist far right an Islamophobia that leads to your support for Bashar al-Assad. And that's pure and simple. And the proof of that is Tim Anderson standing with Jim Salim on a common platform to expound this kind of notion.
First of all, thank you for being a guest, but let me express my extreme disappointment in the very views that are being presented, because we are being fooled into adopting our very own frameworks that led to this problem in the first place. You say it is crap that there's conspiracy theories, but regardless of who wins or loses the conflict, the military, industrial, financial, and entertainment complex makes money and laughs at all of us because we make them rich. You say it's a matter of taking out Assad and replace him with whom? With what? You are saying we are fighting for the right for a home of the Kurds. I am doing that too. But why are we now being forced to take a side between Palestinians and Israelis for a right to a home? Who wins in this kind of conflict? We are being fooled. That's it. They are being played. And I would say it's about time we wake up and talk about what the real picture really is, rather than call each other crap, or liars, or enemies. We are not enemies, we are fools. You are being fooled. You are, and you can't deny it, because you are making, your very participation makes the industrial, military, financial, entertainment complex rich. Congratulations. Thank you.
Sorry, in 5 words or less, the fact that I've heard you make contributions here supporting the Trump of Asia, Duterte, I think that discredits anything that you might say in this forum.
I want to do something unusual. I want to do something. I want to do something unusual here. I want to ask a question where I don't know the answer already.
Right.
And I don't want to make a statement. I guess as a person trying to watch what happened in Syria, we saw what seemed like a populist revolution against a dictator who was okay as long as you didn't do any politics, but it was completely ruthless if you did. And then that seems to have been hijacked by a lot of people with other agenda, what with ISIS and the Kurds, the Israelis and Americans and Russians watching, and the Saudis, and some undercurrent presumably trying to advantage Muslims against a more secular approach. And then this has played out, as you say, as proxies. And it's a bit hard to follow, even from your excellent presentations, exactly what's going on. I still don't really have a picture, to be honest. So I was going to ask, first question is what's likely to happen in future? And the second question, which is kind of related, is to what extent is what happens in the Middle East sort of progressive forces trying to rise and being used, and how, to what extent is it Israel progressively nobbling any group or country that might threaten its dominance?
The reason that perhaps our excellent descriptions of what's going on in the Middle East weren't entirely clear is because God knows what's going on in the Middle East. It is a total mess. And those of us who grew up thinking, okay, we know what's going on, by 2011 were totally bamboozled by everything. But I just should have written your questions down, but one was about what's going to happen in the future. Just one sort of bee in my bonnet, which is I'm working on something at the moment, which is, and you've got to be very careful on this because comparing the West and the Middle East is a very dangerous thing to do. But if you look at 2011 and you look at 1848, which was a year of revolutions in Europe, and you look at the progress there, and you have democratic, you have fascist, Nazi, communist, all sorts of things coming out of it, seems to me that maybe the same sort of laws will apply. I think 2011 clearly told us that people in the Middle East genuinely don't like the system they're in, genuinely want democracy, whether they're Muslim or whatever it is, they want some sort of democracy, their democracy, whatever that is, but that's fine. The forces of reaction have been very effective so far. The Saudis have wiped the board to a great extent at home and in Bahrain and elsewhere. But I really think that their time is limited. Now, I'm not going to say there's going to happen in the next 10 years or whatever, but it seems to me that sooner or later, what happened in 2011, I think, to a great extent, was that you saw regimes, for example, Hosni Mubarak, he was unwell. He was trying to force his grotesque son on the system as his successor. He took his eye off the ball, and the regime lost its capacity to resist. And I think you could say the same thing for Ali Abdullah Saleh, where his structure of alliances broke down in the years leading up to 2011. So there was a problem at the top, and it's a de Tocqueville type argument that a regime that changes or loses control is in deep trouble. And so I think over time these regimes are going to start to lose their focus. I think what's going on in Saudi Arabia with Mohammed bin Salman is very, very interesting because I think he is an awful dictator. He is trying to change and he's very young and inexperienced and may well fail. I don't know. But so over time I think there will be change. And perhaps it will be changed for the better, but there'll be a lot of disaster in between. As far as Israel is concerned, they've certainly, when you look at their main rivals in the Middle East, Syria wasn't really a rival, I don't think. Syria was a country that the Assads kept the border quiet. They certainly got involved in Lebanon, but they kept the border with Israel quiet. Iraq was a threat, although not really, and Iran is a threat, again, but not really. And even leading Israeli politicians have said Iran is not an existential threat to Israel. But they're the ones who challenge hegemony there. So Israel, through the Americans, with the Americans, whatever, has certainly done or has benefited from the decline in any serious opposition. And Egypt. I mean, Nasser is gone and Sadat surrendered. So Egypt is completely taken out of the arena. So that basically Israel has no one now to worry about. So I think they're, that sort of, your suggestion there I think is correct, that the Israelis or the Americans for them have sorted that particular problem out.
Israel wants war with Iran.
Just briefly on the future of Syria, there is the prospect that Assad and Russia take the west and the south of the country, and I don't know, it's hard to predict what US policy is from one week to another, but it seems that they have now, with the help of Kurds on the ground, secured the oil and resource-rich eastern part of Syria, and I don't think they're going to want to give that up lightly. So you've got a situation where, ironically, where we're talking about Korea, you could have a situation where the US and Russia are part of carving up Syria between their relative spheres of interest. About Israel, I think, apart from the Arab dictators, whether pro-Western or supposedly anti-Western, the country that really hated the Arab Spring more than anyone was Israel. And this was partly because they always tried to portray themselves as the only democracy in the Middle East, which was always a lie. It's built on apartheid, as we know, but that was their official rhetoric. But also, as Anthony has said, that many of the Arab dictatorships provided, at best, a rhetorical support for Palestine, were the Palestinians betrayed by the Arab states time and time again. And any idea that there would be governments reflective of a popular will across the Middle East and North Africa would be something that would have sent shudders up Israel's spine. So they were very happy with al-Sisi coming to power in Egypt. I think they're happy that Assad has clung on to power. I think they're happy that the status quo and the counter-revolution succeeded, and that the Middle East wasn't transformed in the way many of us had hoped in 2011.
Yeah, I think it's a bit hard to predict, but the Bernie Sanders and the Jeremy Corbyn sweeping the US and the UK. Perhaps what we are going to see is a more decisive turn to the left in those countries, and if that happens, then there's going to be breathing space. If Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn get in, they cut military funding and they assist refugees and they assist democracy movements in a proper non-imperialist way. That's going to give breathing space to Palestine, and that'll give breathing space to the Arab Spring, the genuine Arab Spring. Look, it's all a bit hard to predict, but we also, we do the best we can in the first world where we're located, in the solidarity movements that arise. And for more information, for comrades to get their heads around the very inspirational moves, the courageous moves that the DFSN are making, check out the Green Left Weekly coverage, is very good. The Region is also a really good news source that looks at the geostrategic interests in the region. And there's a comrade who's an Australian Kurdish comrade, Hoyshan Aziz, on Facebook. She's heading up the Kobani Reconstruction Unit, and so she gives updates on what's happening in Rojava and that region, but she also comments on general politics as well. So they're people to follow, and internationalism. I mean, we defeated apartheid South Africa, and there was people in the mid 70s who said that wasn't going to happen, and we fought that fight and we won. So we struggle on.
I've got a question about the anti-war movement. Years ago we had.
Good question.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm going to ask about. Years ago, with the invasion of Iraq, we had 500,000 people in the streets here. Now, I just want to have just briefly state where I can see the imperialist intervention has been. Obviously, the main imperialist intervention in Syria has been Russia. That is, Russia has played the role in Syria that the US played in Vietnam, of moving in and bombing the shit out of a country and killing thousands of people on behalf of a tyrant who's already killed 500,000 people. Just you had your go, you had your go, man, all right? Okay, but people say, all right, well, that's not us. We have to focus on our own, all right? And we're in the American sphere. So let's look at the American intervention. America has been bombing Syria and Iraq for 4 years. Nobody in the anti-war movement gives a shit about that, right? Now, that intervention that's killed thousands and thousands of civilians. Thousands and thousands. You go to the site Air Wars, and see how many thousands of civilians have been killed by the US air war, right? It's completely destroyed the city of Raqqa. It's completely destroyed the city of Mosul. No one cares, because all this American war is against ISIS, and in Syria also against Jabhat al-Nusra, and sometimes also bombing other Islamist groups. This has been the entire American war, all right? And there's never been any motion from the anti-war movement, and only when, in the rarest of occasions, only after Assad uses chemicals. It doesn't matter if he uses barrel bombs, cluster bombs, napalm, white phosphorus missiles for years and years and years and destroys every city in his country, no problem. But if he uses chemicals, the Americans have to make a symbolic reaction, like the last one, where after Assad's last use of chemicals, there was an attack on 3 empty chemical sites because Trump had told his mate Putin, who told his mate Assad, and so they cleared them out, same as a year ago, and zero civilians were killed. Yeah, that's good. I'm glad 0 civilians were killed. That's very good. I'm just pointing out the difference between thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians being killed by the American bombing, all right? And no one gives a shit. But as soon as there's the most symbolic charade action on Assad, suddenly you get the anti-war movement saying, oh, hands off Syria, no war on Syria, as if that was a war on Syria. I mean, how ridiculous. Now, the other thing about it, though, is, of course, all of these no war on Syria little pickets that happened here in the US and around the world completely flopped. There were a few people on street corners, as is appropriate. And so my question is this, total meaninglessness of the anti-war movement, is this, can we connect this to the disconnect between anti-war movement and solidarity? That is, if you don't, if an anti-war movement is not based on human solidarity, it's just based on a reactionary idea that, well, we're with Assad, even though Assad's destroyed his old country and killed 500,000 people, we're with Assad because we're against him. Right? If this total disconnect between the concept of being anti-war and the concept of solidarity, is this the reason, right? Do the speakers think this might be part of the reason for this total collapse of any kind of anti-war movement?
I really agree with that, Michael, and I mean, it is a tragedy what has happened, I guess, to the anti-war movement. The earliest I remember it, I guess, is 2009 when there was a Green Revolution in Iran for democracy. And many of us who were involved in the anti-war movement against the US war in Iraq refused to support that Green Revolution for democracy because they believed that, insultingly, I think, that the Iranian people dying on the streets were puppets of US imperialism. And I think that same analysis by elements of the anti-war movement carried over to the Arab Spring, that it was all a CIA plot, that there was no agency on the part of the Arab people or the Arab masses or the Arab popular classes. I think quite an Orientalist view of the Middle East, actually. And unfortunately, I think that's some of the political reasons why the anti-war movement's in the kind of morass that it now is in. There needs to be one. I mean, I was part with Rachel's comrades, Pip and Peter from Social Alliance and Helen. After Trump's latest theatrics, there was one called by us where we tried to say no to all the bombings, no to Trump's, no to Russia's, no to Assad's. And I think that's the only basis on which an anti-war movement can really be built at this point in time. Not one that says that the US is the only imperialism that we're ever going to fight against, or not ones that selectively quote Karl Liebknecht to say the only enemy or the main enemy is at home, because the other part of his quote, of course, was that we need to cooperate with the proletariat of other countries in their fight against their own imperialists. It doesn't mean we're blind to that, but I think the enemy is at home has been an excuse not to extend the hand of solidarity to the people of Syria in some ways.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that the anti-war movement has both been attacked. Well, it is at a weak point. I think I think the height of the Iraq War and not stopping US imperialism in Iraq also demoralised the anti-war movement. And Arundhati Roy came out and said we shouldn't have assumed that we could have stopped the imperialists in their tracks just by one massive mobilisation, the largest mobilisation in human history against the Iraq War, that we needed a sustained movement. And so when, and as Syria, the tragedy unfolds, the movement is weakened by the divisions around the pro-Assad, which, I think it's, to support a dictator is absolutely unjustifiable. That has divided the movement, and that's, we'll have to pick ourselves up from where we are and rebuild. But, I think the other thing is, unfortunately, the Vietnam War syndrome is the US has waged a campaign to get rid of that, and the Iraq and Afghanistan anti-war movements weren't sustained enough to fight that off. And that's also partly because the unions have been pummeled and there's a working class retreat due to the neoliberal offensive. The unions weren't as strong. They were certainly stronger in the 70s. There's all these reasons for it, but we work with what we've got. So long live the struggle, and for Syria to breathe, and for us to advance a peaceful world. There is the example of the northern Syrian experiment.
Just quickly, I think part of the problem also is that you have two images. You have the barrel bombs and you have the man holding somebody's head, or a child holding somebody's head. It's a very confusing picture. We talked earlier about Syrians in the country being divided, being from different perspectives. And so you don't have a unified approach to this. And where are the leaders on this? The Liberal Party and the Labor Party are in the same bed in this respect. There's nobody, as with Iraq, really, nobody standing up and saying, this is wrong, come on, do something about it. And I think people do, more generally, I'm not talking very specifically, but more generally, people need a bit of a guidance, a bit of encouragement from their leaders. And it just doesn't exist at the moment.
Yes, it seems to me that with these conflicts, major conflicts that are rising as history progresses from the Second World War, the countries that are playing the proxy role in maintaining the conflicts by feeding arms generated by their major corporations, General Electric, etc. You reach a threshold in a conflict that happens these days, for instance, the one we're talking about, where even if there is a great amount of pressure within the governments of the countries that are advantaging themselves by selling arms to places like what we're talking about, the corporations within those countries, through their lobbying of their governments, are a bulwark against any semblance of a finalised outcome whereby peace can be achieved. Do you think there's a threshold by which we may have already crossed this particular conflict, whereby this will go on for years and years and years because people are making such a lot of money out of it?
My name is Selo. I'm a Turkish leftist. Now, tonight, I'm very surprised to see big misinformation about what's happening in the region. And I feel sad about it, actually. None of the speakers talk about the actual reason of why Syrian war started. The reason is Qatar gas pipeline. Qatar wanted, the US and Qatar, they wanted the gas to go through Syria, Turkey, to Europe. And the Russian, with the pressure from Russia, Syrian government didn't want it. Until that time, Erdogan and Assad, they were brothers. At that moment, with the pressure from US, Turkey said to Assad, you have to accept this one, otherwise you have to go. Assad didn't accept it. Then Turkey, also Erdogan had a dream of a Sunni area, northern Syria. Turkey, US, and Qatar, they supported all the jihadists in the area, and they entered northern Syria. This is the reason for the Syrian war. At the beginning, there is nothing between Turkey and Syria. When it started, then a lot of other things started to happen. ISIS came into play, and the US-backed groups, they used this one for the ethnic cleansing of the area. Please ask some questions. Kurds make up only less than 5% of the population in Syria, less than 5%. Look at the second page of the map distributed here. They control all the natural resources. They control all the dams, all the petrol areas. And then here, they said that from Ghouta, all the people went to Idlib. Did you see the pictures of these people going from the south of Syria to Idlib area? They are all killer jihadists. Please look at the pictures carefully. And lastly, Assad now controls, maybe as the land less of the Syria, but he controls more than 80% of the people. And just think about it. In a war, why would they support a dictator? Assad has the full support of the people because the alternative is a jihadist country. Thank you.
Look, there are always economic factors behind any war. I have read about this pipeline dispute, but I still reject the idea that this is the fundamental cause of it. Basically, you have a dictatorship, and there's no other way to describe it, that its only means of dealing with dissent is repression. And whereas the Egyptian and Tunisian dictatorships fell, Assad was not going to give an inch. Okay, to answer the question about what was going to be the alternative if Assad fell, I would say a bottom-up mass movement that we did see in 2011 that crossed the religious sectarian divide, a sectarian divide that the regime has been more too happy to fuel, to basically say, if I fall, all you Alawis, all you Christians are going to be slaughtered en masse. And that's the basis on which he has ruled, divide and rule. But it's important to say that many of his big bourgeoisie supporters and the capitalist cronies that I talked about are actually not Alawi but Sunni, but that shows the class division within also the Sunni community, because it's the mass working class areas in the slums of the big urban cities that have been the supporters. Sorry, I think there's a lot more to say about what you say about his support. I think he rules by fear. I have Syrian refugee friends who basically say, you know, you have to go into the ballot box and say yes or no. They're going to know the way you vote. They're going to know the way you vote. Also, many of the internally displaced people from the rebel-held areas who've gone to regime, supporters of the regime always quote this to me. Why are they going to regime-controlled areas? Well, you know, if you've got a family with kids, many of them will make a pragmatic decision to go somewhere where the bombs aren't falling on your head on a daily basis and live with the fact that you're going to have to live under a repressive, authoritarian dictatorship, but at least you're still going to live unless you step out of line politically.
Sorry, just as the chair, I would just like to ask another last question, because we've had two speakers talking about the movements for democratic change with the Syrian opposition and with the Rojava Kurds. And unfortunately, they didn't collaborate, it would seem, right from the beginning, which may be seen as a mistake. I don't know, I don't understand the reasons behind that fully. But do you think there's any chance now that the Rojava Kurds and the movement there for grassroots democracy and the remnants of the Syrian opposition that was democratically based could join forces and develop a program to help each other?
Great question. Look, there was some reading I did on the negotiations that the PYD are holding, and they have had meetings with Assad, and those meetings have been unfruitful. So Assad has been saying, you can have this canton, this northeast canton, but it's going to be a Kurdish canton, and that is unacceptable to the PYD and the DFNS because it's a multi-ethnic, plural ethnic confederalist model. So they're calling on Assad to hold elections across Syria in a democratic fashion, and Assad is balking. So there are negotiations underway, but I think there needs to be a stronger solidarity movement, and the region, because of Turkey's invasion of Afrin, now the project is at a weaker point. The PYD didn't take sides, it's true, in 2011, and for the Kurdish comrades and the leadership that I've spoken to, they're saying, well, it was a tactical decision, and looking at it, it would have been that coming together of the forces, the democratic forces, you would have thought would have assisted, but it's very hard from us from the West as keyboard warriors, and and as talking to the migrant leadership. Even some of them get to Turkey, some of them have those conversations with the PYD leadership, but very few are really in the tactical discussions, the blow-by-blow tactical discussions. So that being said, you can envisage if there's an upsurge in Jordan, there might be an upsurge, an inspiration wave, another Arabic 2011, an Arabic 2019, and that would then lift up the possibilities for stronger alliances in Syria. So, but of course, I think comrades and friends should get to know the Kurdish leadership in Sydney a bit more concretely. If we are talking about the Middle Eastern politics, then we do need to collaborate with the comrades who are doing the solidarity work here and eke some more information out of them. And that will give us a rounded, more inspirational view, because they're courageous actions. I mean, it's like the Nicaraguan Revolution, all these anti-colonial, anti-capitalist revolutions of the 80s and 90s in Latin America. Well, now we have something in the Middle East.
Jan, I think your question is the question of the night. And I did mean to get to that in part. I think I made reference to some of the problems on both sides. Like, I know I talked about the question of neutrality, which Rachel's talked about. Like, I wish that the Kurdish leadership had come out more openly in support of the uprising in Syria. And I wish, on the other hand, that the Syrian revolutionaries had made it far more explicit, their support for Kurdish rights and Kurdish autonomy, because many of them, I met some of the Syrian left when I was in Istanbul last year, and many of them said, look, yes, we support that, but first we've got to get rid of Assad. It's sort of as a stage thing, rather than seeing it as an integral part of the struggle in uniting. So, but as Rachel said, it's easy for us Western leftists to formulate these things. It's a much harder thing to put it into practice on the ground. But I think they're natural allies, given that the Assad dynasty, the Baathists, oppressed the Kurdish for so many decades. There was a natural alliance there ready to happen. And I think, if we are to have a resurgence of the spirit of 2011, that sort of unity needs to be reforged on a much stronger basis, despite the setbacks in around Afrin and around Aleppo and things like that.
I think we're ready to wind up. It's getting a bit late. So thank you all for staying and being such an engaged audience tonight. And I'd like to thank the speakers, please, once again. Thank you.